Welcome to another episode of Random Book Talk. I'm Meredith Curnow, the Knopf Vintage Publisher at Random House Australia. It's been my pleasure and privilege to publish the works of fiction and non-fiction from Tom Keneally for around 5 years now. Tom Keneally is the author of the Booker Prize-winning Schindler's Ark. Steven Spielberg later made it into the Academy Award-winning film Schindler's List. Tom's other books include the memoir Searching for Schindler, Three Famines, which was a Los Angeles Times Book of the Year, The People's Train, and The Commonwealth of Thieves. The Daughters of Mars is Tom's latest novel and our June Book of the Month. Welcome, Tom. I've often wondered, Tom, given that solid historical research is the basis of all your storytelling, how do you decide if your next book will be fiction or non-fiction, and where do you get your ideas from?
I decide between fiction and non-fiction by instinct. Whether the instinct's reliable or not, I just feel that this is a non-fiction book. Of course, if you're going to cover a huge scope of history and include many characters, then you tend to go for history. If you're going to look at history through the point of view of characters on the margin who act within great events of history, but they're very obscure people within those great events, the novel seems to be suited, and that's why the novel of these two sisters, who are, in a sense, marginal figures. They come from the margins of the earth to participate in huge historic events, the events of World War I. That's why that's a novel.
The Daughters of Mars tells the story of the Durrant sisters, Naomi and Sally, and they're from the Macleay Valley on the mid-New South Wales north coast, not quite the ends of the earth. And they're women of a particular kind of spirit, aren't they? And they're escaping an event that affected their conscience deeply. Is that why you've chosen to tell the story through their perspective, the perspective of nurses?
Yes, I was fascinated by nurses because they saw the outfall from the conflict at the front. And in World War I, you had new elements that were not seen or taken account of in other conflicts. Shell shock and gas, the sort of the stripping of the lungs and the throats and the eye linings of ordinary men by the use of dreadful chemicals, which were ultimately outlawed for war. I thought that I've always been interested in the way Australians become involved in these huge European events. When I was a kid, my father was 3 years in the Middle East, fighting a war that was, above all, a European war. And therefore, even though North Africa was the arena, and the crime they commit is that they mercy killed their mother between them. And I don't mind giving that away. And then they try to lose themselves, as Australians occasionally do, in great cosmic events. They try to reduce the crime they've committed to a smaller scale by encountering the young men, the shattered young men who come from the battlefield. And of course they don't expect it to be, no one expects that cataclysm of World War I to be quite as ruinous and tragic as it turned out to be. At the time they entered it, they thought it would be like earlier colonial wars and imperial wars. just slightly bigger and slightly more decisive.
Through Naomi and Sally Durrance, Tom, you show us that you know an awful lot about sisters, their incredible inner rage against each other and their overwhelming love. How can you know about sisters?
Well, I had 2 daughters, and that was an education. For the rest, I think that interaction is guided, the way you write it is guided by your subconscious. I have no doubt about that. For example, there's a scene in there where they go for tea together, just the 2 of them. They're very aloof girls. They're very Methodist girls, these girls. And fellas find it hard to get close to them. And yet they're good looking, so fellas want to get close to them. They go to tea together in Alexandria to try to come to some terms with the death of their mother back in Australia, and to try to get closer to each other, because their involvement in the death of their mother has driven them apart from each other. It's as if they want to avoid each other because the other is a reminder of what they've done. Now, what happens during that get-together in a hotel in Alexandria, the way they come to an accommodation, that's all done, that comes from writing it and then writing it again. And as I said earlier, relying on your instinct for these things, because the Durrance sisters are not only women, they're also human beings. So part of it is what you know about being a human being, the relationship between them, and part of it is entirely feminine.
In The Daughters of Mars, you detail at length the horrors of war, the medical procedures used to try and save these poor amputees, disfigured men. People have been gassed. Do you think we've perhaps concentrated too much on the heroics of war and not spent enough time investigating the other?
Yes, indeed. I wrote a book years ago on the war in East Africa between the Ethiopians and Eritreans, the people that, the latter being the people Fred Hollows used to go and operate on, and where there's a Fred Hollows laboratory to this day. I went to Eritrea a number of times and saw a number of wounds, many of which made me physically sick. And I thought, I've never seen any of these wounds mentioned, you know, when a politician stands up and comes up with these easy cliches about the diggers and so on. We like to think that the Australians were special kinds of troops, and they were. And the fact that they were citizen soldiers did give them a certain panache, brio, but it didn't protect them any more than it protected troops of any other country against high explosives, against gas. They were mere flesh. And the wounds that horrified me most in Eritrea were the facial wounds, where shrapnel would bear a face away and leave, say, an eye and a bit of cheek. And there is a character in the book, lieutenant or captain or lieutenant constable, I forget his rank, who is one of the first Australians wounded in France. And most of his face is torn away. And throughout the book, after operation, before he can be operated on, they've got to prevent blood poisoning in his face. So they have to irrigate it with solution and bathe it and dress it every day. And this exercise makes Sally and one of her friends, Honora, very close to the young man. And he is both, there is an extent to which he pities himself, because your face is who you are, you know, and he's got to go back and live in Narromine with this monstrous face, or face that's been remade. So they keep the wound clean for 6 months, and he's sent off to England, and he has operation after operation after operation, and they keep in contact with him throughout this process. And wounds such as his are not, again, not generally mentioned amongst the cliches that one comes across emerging from the lips of politicians on Australia Day, and I'm sorry, on Anzac Day. And so I wanted to, it's definitely an anti-war novel. I did want to show, as many of the old diggers wanted to say, that war was horrifying and astounding and irrational, but it does lock us in. There's something about it that is also inescapable. You see that with the Quaker orderly Ian Kiernan, that he is trapped in it despite his best pacifist impulses. And I think that a history of war from the point of view of the wounded and those who tend them is in very many ways a credible way to tell the story.
Absolutely. Tom Keneally, can you name the book that has most influenced your life and tell us why?
I think Patrick White's Voss influenced me, because it was one of the first books that made me realise that Australians can write novels, and it made me, it excited me in its style and narration, and it sort of empowered me to write, or at least to try to write.
Thank you, Tom. If you would like to download a sample chapter of The Daughters of Mars, please go to randomhouse.com.au. Join us next month when we'll be talking to the international best-selling author Susan Lewis about her new novel, No Child of Mine.